Hello and welcome to the fifth part of the Mike McNair Revolutionary Strategy series. We have a reasonable sized panel today. We've got Derick Barn back from the dead. Derick, how's it going?
I'm okay.
Good to hear it. And also we've got Lexi and Sophie sitting together, I presume, in Arizona. Am I right?
Hello. Yep, you are correct, Tom.
Hey, you guys in my time zone now?
Yeah, we're
Ooh.
chilling in Mountain Time.
Yep, we're all in the same time zone. Sweet.
Woo!
Ooh. You and John Denver, huh?
That's right.
Okay. Let's see if I can share this screen. Today we're going to do chapter 3, the revolutionary strategy of the center. Today we've done the last 2 chapters. We're on a bit of a roll. You know, everybody is well pumped for this. What does anybody want to? Derick, you haven't been on for a while. Have you? What do you have anything to say before we start?
Well, this seems to be mostly about the development of the German Social Democratic Party after Kautsky and down to 1914. Has a weird digression about historical materialism, and then goes through the historical Marxist Center, which also to remember, it didn't call itself that. That is McNair's laboring. Key points, which is, self-emancipation of majority, patience in development, their definition of the role of the state, their definition of the role of theory, their definition of the issues with the nation state, and that's it. So it's just like the other chapters, super dense, but I feel like when you start talking about this, is getting into the area where more leftists kind of sort of know the history. But I'd be interested in like the different tendencies reading of this history outside of this book, because this is also the time period that gets the most mystified and there are the most ideological glosses on 1891 to 1914.
Well, right, because this is where these are just the fake Marxists, the betrayers. Don't worry about them. We'll move on to the real Marxists in a little bit, but we just have to establish all these fakers. It's usually how this comes out in party histories or something like that.
Yeah,
well, I sorry, Derick. I was just going to say, I kind of disagree with you that everybody knows this history. I think that, the history nerds know it, but the general people who have, a liking just of socialism and communism or say whatever, they don't know this stuff. I certainly didn't know it until I started, maybe reading this book.
Well, I think what they meant by lefties meant that is what they meant like history nerds. They meant the intelligentsia, quote unquote, or like dorks like us who talk in a podcast. You know what I mean? Like, it's not like a general public, and like you're, run of the mill, anarchist doing little organizing projects here and there probably doesn't know a lot of this stuff either. Yeah,
but a lot of I don't know, trots that are isomorphic or to anarchists that are activists or social. I don't know, there's a lot of activists that would know of this history in instrumentalized form.
Trots, Maoist, anybody who comes from a sectarian tradition, their hagiography usually starts here.
But what Tom is saying also shouldn't be lost is that Tom is saying people, not leftists or activists.
The great majority of people don't know it. And also, I mean, to be fair to Tom's other point, and kind of mine, sort of, is that also the hagiography is not true. So, so a lot of people who think they know this probably don't as much as they think they do. I mean, the number of times that people have told me that Kautsky voted for the war, for example, just illustrates me that they don't actually know this history. And I've seen that printed in academic books because they trusted party histories. Ooh, so,
ouch. Yeah.
Brill has 2 books that say it.
Yeah, I've honestly said that until kind of vaguely recently.
Yeah, I wrote a paper that said Bernstein voted for the war, which I think is also false, because this stuff is so mystified, and it's genuinely hard to wrap one's mind around what really happened in a certain way. And McNair's framework for it has clarified my thinking on it significantly.
And I don't want to jump too much ahead too, but that when they started quoting Ingalls on this matter, I was honestly kind of shook.
Yeah.
Okay.
Lexi,
Well, like, yeah. I think on top of just people don't know about it, I think what we kind of want people to know about, but also get people to see why this strategy is important. You know, you don't need to be a buff to get this simple idea behind a strategy. We should be using this to inform people's opinions on, you know, the DSA, the Labour Party, Syriza, 15M, you know, all of these things. We're going to see from this, people who aren't aware of all this mad history, aren't aware of, say, the ins and outs of all this stuff, aren't even like, I think the vast majority of people aren't sectarian. They're just kind of people that are isolated leftists. So it's for those people that it's nearly most important for, because you're not really going to reach sectarian people in any. People are going to have their own silly ideas that they'll only ever break with when they're ready to break.
Right.
But
well,
like,
I have some friends locally who kind of like recently, or a friend in particular who recently broke with anarchism, and it's kind of like a baby Marxist now. And this is like the book I would give her as like an intro to like socialist history, because like although it's dense, as Derick said earlier, it talks about the most important points and what to extrapolate from that history rather than just kind of being academic about it. Not that there's anything wrong necessarily with learning history, but this builds, like, looks at history and tries to build a strategy from that. You know what I mean? And I think for like new organizers, that's key, especially for those who aren't, you know, enmeshed in a sect yet, you know?
Yeah. This is a much easier intro than the other book I would give people as an introduction, which is Hal Draper's 5-volume over, you know, over like 2,000-page history of Marx and the revolutionary political theory, or whatever that five series book is called that I read, because that's the other good one. But this is way more approachable.
That's Karl Marx's theory of revolution.
Yeah.
One thing I would say as well is that while it is dense, it's not very difficult.
Yeah.
You know, it's chock-a-block with interesting stuff and good, clear writing about explaining the strategical decisions that were made by people. But it's not difficult to understand. It actually reads quite well. That's the amazing strength of it.
The only part of it that is minorly distracting is the amount of different groups he kind of references offhand.
Oh yeah, we
agreed.
Yeah,
we made a lot of comments about the sect Olympics going on in here and how maybe that's like the least interesting part and the most remote part. But yeah, I guess like I wrote McNair at one point. I wanted to make like an edited version of this for American audiences. I wonder, you know, what that would be. You know what I mean? Other than changing the S's to Z's or something, you know, like and the centre to center, and you know.
I mean, in this chapter and particularly in the next chapter, I mean, as much as McNair says he doesn't know anything about America, he uses some American Marxist figures as key thinkers. I mean, he's got a whole like section on Hal Draper, for example, and then the American Trotskyists come up a lot.
Yeah.
Well, I know what you do is you just get like any reference of communists and revolutionaries, and you just call them the Democratic Party, and then you're done.
I thought you just put a Twitter wet flower there, and then we would be fine.
Yeah. No, the center tendency in the DSA was also its ideological leadership. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Ouch.
Boom.
Roses are red, violets are reformist. The end.
Yeah, I guess actually what would really happen is that if you read this, virtually every single fucking organized thing you've ever seen in your entire life is a right socialist formation.
Yep.
And not only in your entire life, but in most of socialist history. Like,
Yeah.
and yeah.
Except for the left socialist formations, which are even crazier. But
Right. But again, that, like I said, organized, right? Like,
well, the
Yeah.
longest are organized if you're in
Okay.
Chicago.
If you're in Chicago.
okay, let's pretend Delinus exists. Right, okay.
Well,
Okay,
like,
let's
I
go.
mean, you
Let's go.
would have to. Sorry.
Sorry.
Okay.
sorry,
You
I
would
was
have
thinking-
to.
So the center tendency of the Social Democratic Party and the Second International was also its ideological leadership. Despite the eventually disastrous errors and betrayals, this tendency had a massive historical achievement to its credit. It, as a side note, we know that it was the largest political party in Germany for a while. Led the building of a mass workers' movement, socialist parties of late 19th to 20th century Europe, and the creations of the Second International. Leftist advocates of the modernized strike, in contrast to either group of schools like modern far leftists such as Delonist, are militant but ephemeral movements such as the Industrial Workers of the World. I mean, that's kind of a sick burn, but
Okay, when we're going to be reading these, I want us to leave out all of these obscure fucking sects that he mentions, like the Leonists. I have no idea who they are. I forget. I don't even want to talk about them.
No, we'll skip that. But I think I don't think you would say the IWW is obscure.
No,
no,
I'm
not saying that. Yeah, people tend to know that.
Bullshit.
So people, I think a lot of people don't even know who the Second International is. This is like the second attempt at unifying the European left in the early 20th century.
And honestly, the Second International got larger than the European left. Even like there were people in Asia and Latin America involved. I mean, not in huge amounts, but they did exist.
Okay. So what he's saying here is that the center tendency, the one that we're going to describe in this chapter, that was the one that was responsible for the largest, pretty much you would say, revolutionary party. People might say German Social Democratic Party was or wasn't. It was definitely very militant. It was not a right party because it followed the center tendency. It ended up being one, but it wasn't at this stage. I think that's a fair comment. Is that, what do people think about
that? Like, he doesn't do this now, but when he starts talking about the way that unity with the right forces you into a corner, maybe we might say it's like I don't know, like there's a de facto coalitionism that even the SPD is guilty of, which is one of the harder things to grapple with. And that's what the, quote, historic center is really known for.
Yeah.
And when you look at Lenin's texts, the people that are thinking about the center, quote unquote, the most, it's just a fucking ragdoll, like it's merely a capitulationist, like smokescreen. There's nothing else there.
But what's interesting about this, and this is, kind of spoiler warning, I guess, but is that like those critiques of the center tendency are actually correct in a sense, and that's kind of what the end of this chapter gets at. But it's not only that these critiques of the center tendency are correct. This issue with the center tendency, their problems come from Marx and Engels themselves.
Yeah, like a lot of them do.
Yeah,
and it's pretty cool that he lays out the center, and you think he's just going to advocate for it, but then he kind of rags on it, and then after ragging on it, he still kind of advocates for it.
That's where the neo comes in, I suppose.
Yeah,
they have to be honest about those mistakes.
Let's keep going. So sorry to talk over you. Sorry, that's twice I've done that.
No, I was done. That's cool.
Yeah. So because this is quite a long chapter, there's a lot of stuff to talk of, I think, in it. Okay, so what we're saying is that he makes out this tendency that the center was the one that ran the Social Democratic Party. And what we're saying in reality was a little bit more smoky than that they were kind of in coalition with their own right of their own social democratic kind of element and they try to hold the party together and try and keep its revolutionary bent. But some of the people, we get onto it later, kind of talk about whether the center really was in charge or whether it was the right. But let's just talk about how McNair or Kautsky would think of the center. I think is probably the best way to do it. Let's read this paragraph here. Who wants to have a go at this one? Lexi, do you want to give this one a go?
Yeah, I'll go for it. All right. The center tendency did not, of course, identify itself as such. It self-identified as the continuers and defenders of, quote, orthodox Marxism against, quote, anarchists, to its left, but not in the center's view, and, quote, revisionists, to its right. In this sense, it was primarily defined by negative judgments on the coalition strategy of the right and the mass strike strategy of the left. Both Kautsky's The Social Revolution and his The Road to Power are extremely cautious in making positive categorical claims, predictive claims about strategy. There are nonetheless some core principled understandings about strategy which emerge from the arguments.
So one of the things that I both like about this, and it makes this maddeningly to talk about, is the terms like revisionist have been co-opted and redefined. So for example, revisionist after 1951 means something completely different than it did in 1909.
Yeah.
Partly because
explain that, Derick.
Oh, well, because Stalinist, I mean, because because a group of Stalinists used it to criticize, the Soviet, the formal Soviet state in a way that had to do with geopolitics and not to do with capitalist development theory. But it was a way of smearing them as really being secret Bernsteinists. But the latter meaning is now what everybody means when they use the term. And when they see this stuff mentioned in these early SPD texts, they often, frankly, read the post-1950s definition onto it, which is wrong.
But useful.
Yeah, I mean, but this is a constant problem when we talk about this with sectarians or with normal people, because some of this baggage and language actually doesn't just affect sectarianism. It was kind of like the talk of official communism and the tensions within it for 40 years. So anyone who's older than, say, 40 actually has heard these terms used in a completely different way.
Okay, so
maybe we should define revisionism just to make it clear then. Like, revisionism is just like a revision to the basic ideas of like Marx and Engels.
Sort of like last week we did the right. We did the coalitionist right and the Bernsteinist kind of package of critiques of Marx and Engels' dialectics, of their predictions for the trajectory of capitalism and for their revolutionary politics. So that there was a distinct package of, quote, revision like that.
Yeah, so the simplified version is that the Bernsteinists were evolutionists, not revolutionists, and they were revisionists for revising revolution as a necessity, right? There's more complications than that, but that's like the TR,
okay,
the TLDR web version.
So when he says revisionist, there are people who are trying to, in this sense, where they were revising Marx as to be, some kind of social democrat. And when Stalinists mean it, they mean it's somebody who has done what exactly?
Somebody who sided with Khrushchev's criticism of Stalin.
Okay, fair enough. So that's that's our short version. I'm not going to use these poxy acronyms. I hate acronyms, especially anyone that Emmanuel is responsible for introducing into my brain.
Hey, he's not even here. He's not even here. So.
I can talk about him. He might even listen to it. Okay.
So I think it's just his sweet engineer tendencies. But anyway,
Perhaps.
I've been reading this today, and I've kind of underlined for the next like 3 or 4 pages, nearly the whole goddamn plot. So it's like same as it ever was. Let me have a read of this little paragraph here. Okay, so organization. For the center tendency, the strength of the proletariat and its revolutionary capacity flows not from the employed workers' power to withdraw their labor, but from the power of the proletariat as a class to organize. It is organization that makes a difference between a spontaneous expression of rage and rebellion, like a riot, and a strike as a definite action for definite and potentially winnable goals. I think that's a very interesting, simple point he's making. Like, if we compare this to, like, say, anarchists or say
communization theorists,
communization theorists, yeah. So they kind of talk more about it's like the strike what done it, but really it's about the ability to organize. That's where the center comes from. The power of it is through the ability for people to get together and work and plan and come up with their organizations.
Well, doesn't McNair in an earlier chapter also talk about how part of the strategy of Marx and Engels was to not just organize employed labor, but like organize like class by districts, including unemployed people. And I think when you're focused on like
stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So like when you're focused solely on productive labor and the ability to strike, you're missing out on a whole bunch of people who are, you know, arguably worse off and probably more sympathetic to, you know, a revolutionary program.
And that's sort of a hole in the way that, I don't know, Marxism has tended to address the problems of the proletariat by doing trade union politics. But it also makes sense. In a way, you want to build centers of proletarian power, and, you know, the form that was historically available that Marx looked to, I mean, yeah, it was for the most part organized labor, and only in its most radical elements did it get to, you know, organizing the unemployed.
Right, and the other thing is Marx has an ambivalence about the unemployed. Because
that's dirty.
Because Marx, and I'm not even going to say wrongly, because frankly, if you've ever seen a revolutionary group who actually incorporates criminal elements into their group, they almost always invite the state to squash them really fast. But there was this fear of the lumpen, which Marx seems to have meant criminal, but sometimes meant perpetually unemployed, but he wasn't clear on that. Like, it's not really defined.
It does improve as he gets older and as he gets more serious about political economy. But I don't know if he ever, you know, says, mea culpa, I was so wrong about the lumpen, man. Like,
well, I mean, the thing is, I know this is going to be a kind of, I don't know, maybe this is a hot take. He's not totally wrong about the lumpen. Like, you don't want lots of, I don't know, like mafiosos in your revolutionary group. Like, like,
I think
just the hitmen. Just the hitmen.
Well, I think but more seriously, like I agree that like you shouldn't have like, you know, maybe gang, you know, activity in your organizing. That's a bad idea. But I think for me, like my hot take on the lumpen is that there needs to be well, what I would love to see is like what the SPD did with like education collectives and programs like that. Is just the ability to help, you know, like mutual aid programs to help lumpen, you know, not only in like a welfare sense, but also to help them get back on their feet, you know, and if socialists can provide that, you know, and that's like the more charitable like take on anarchism is that the best anarchists are also doing this stuff with their like ideas of mutual aid. Mutual aid will often address both unemployed and employed workers,
right?
So doing similar things.
Well, I guess this gets to some of the debates around class, but we can move on because this actually can be a pretty deep.
This is a deep debate, and it runs through all of Marxism, and McNair's representing a lot of the best of Marxism. It's still a problem with him, but that doesn't mean that he has nothing to say about it. This stuff about strikes and organization and that contrast with the spontaneous outburst of a riot is still something that you can use as an analytic for non-labor organizing activity.
Yeah, like I was living in London here when the London riots happened, I think in like 2011, 2012. And like they were pretty full on, like the whole city was pretty much shut down for and the riots, you know, like where I'm living here in Woolwich, like probably 25% of the shops got smashed up. Quite a number of them got burnt down. You know, there was a lot of damage done. And if you looked at how the BBC were able to talk about the people who are rioting, like literally the word that they were using was like rats and vermin, you know, stuff like that. Now, if they were done with an obviously organized political motive, they couldn't use those words about it, even if the outcome was the same. It just would be a different thing. So it just shows like this idea of organization is, to me, very important. Anyway, let me read the next paragraph. So we'll never get anywhere if we don't. Moreover, as soon as we move beyond craft unionism, which relies on skills monopolies to coerce the employer, the difference between victory and defeat in a strike is the ability of the solidarity of the class as a whole to sustain the strikers in the face of the economic and political pressure the employers can exert. Finally, it's the need and potential ability of the proletariat as a class to organize democratically when we enter into a mass strike wave or revolutionary crisis that represents the potential alternative authority to the authority of the capitalist class. Okay.
There's a whole lot to unpack here.
Yeah, have a go.
Well, one, I mean, so the moving beyond craft unionism, which just relies on skills monopolies to coerce employers into better conditions. One of the things I get criticized for in the left for saying a lot is that a lot of modern unions are effectively craft unions, and that the most successful strikes right now in the United States are craft union strikes. If you look at the recent data on the increase in strikes, when there's been a massive uptick, but the great majority of them have been teachers and nurses, and those are craft unions. My hyper-conservative brother supports craft unionism. He thinks that, you know, people who have a special skill, which they need to, like, you know, not be exploited more for, have a right to unions. Regular workers don't. And like that distinction has been lost in all of our recent discussions about unions. And when I pointed out, people get mad, like viscerally mad. And so you can't really even talk about some of these larger issues, because you have to talk about the, you know, class strikes, you know, and class organization. I mean, Kautsky was famous in The Road to Power saying, and, you know, I remember realizing this a few years ago, that if you could actually successfully pull up a mass strike and the capitalists not starve you out, you can also pull off a military revolution. So why not just go ahead?
Right.
Because normally the reason why general strikes don't work is capitalists have more resources than proletarian, and the proletarian will eventually starve themselves. Unless they have the ability to really democratically organize in a way that they can actually take over and hold the means of production, not just stop it. And
or if they have enough food.
Yeah.
You know, if they literally can produce food themselves.
Well, yeah, that's why
like
the peasant coalitions. That's why the peasant coalitions were really important. But those don't work as well in fully developed capitalist countries because peasants just don't exist in the same way. So
completely. It's funny this about the unions. Like, I've been a member of 2 unions in my life. When I used to work for Ericsson's in Ireland, they made you join the union. They had one union, and it was called the Marine Port and General Workers Union. And they and also in the bank, I worked in a bank, and there was Irish Bank Officials Association, and it wasn't technically a union, but it pretty much was, I think. But how it operated in Ireland was that to get a job in management, do you know what you had to do?
Be a member of the
leader in the union.
Oh my god!
Become a leader in the union.
Wee woo.
It was done.
Wow.
Oh, that is such collaborationist horse shit. All right.
Yeah.
But that was literally. So if you wanted to get a good job in management, they encouraged you to become like a union rep.
That is so backwards.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very bad.
But it's really smart, though. Think about it. They get all the people in charge of the union as the most kind of class traitors. It's a fantastic idea.
Well, I mean, they do differently in America, but we pay union leaders out of stock dividends. I swear to God.
So, yeah. It's
Well, I mean, this kind of leads to like the discourse around unions in the United States too, because like the hot takes on unions are either they're all bourgeois, bullshit, and you shouldn't bother with them, or it's overly romanticized, like rah rah rah, unions are great. Let's not talk about how it's basically craft unionism, and people's emotions kind of get in the way of like a true and honest analysis about what it means. Like it's certainly a good thing that there's more strikes going on, but like we need to be honest about what that is,
Yeah, and particularly the thing that gets me the most are Marxists that kind of give up on struggles around labor,
right?
Because of the kind of trends in like non-craft unionism, and then go, but it's a good thing. That's good because we'll find another way. And
I used to say that too, and then I realized
me too.
In like 6 years, I have not even foreseeably kind of sort of even a little bit come up with another way.
Yeah, I want to be open to what whatever history throws at us, but it's hard to imagine something that isn't about labor in some essential capacity. I don't know, creating the kind of organizational glue to create an alternative set of institutions that you can transfer power to.
Right.
Yeah. And unions won't be the organizational form. Like it's what's most important is how radicalized people are. That this, actually, I'm not going to totally edit fucking this. That was totally incoherent. Is there anything else in this paragraph anybody wants to say?
Nope, we can move on.
Move on. Okay, it's paragraph by paragraph. Derick, you read the next one, but you're not allowed to read it like you did the last one because that was at 140 miles an hour. actually read it like you want somebody to be able to understand.
Sorry, I read my poetry that way too. All right.
Speed poetry.
Proletarian organization need not only be employed in the form of strike action. Solidarity and the power to organize can also create cooperatives of various sorts. Workers' educational institutions, workers' papers, workers' political parties. And it can turn out the vote for workers' candidates in public elections. Strong votes for a workers' party will increase the self-confidence and sense of solidarity of a working class as a class and its ability to organize and act, not just electorally, but in other arenas of struggle, such as strikes, for example. I think this is pretty straightforward and kind of obvious.
But saying, like, if we're actually proletarian, one of the things we're going to have is a fucking political party. And if the political, it'll be a synergistic relationship between, the class organizing itself and the party doing well. And it'll be a feedback mechanism on each other. It's all very straightforward stuff. What do you, Lexi or Sophie, what do you think? Any thoughts?
I was just going to say, do you think you would have, at this point, if you were rewriting this or editing this for an American audience, would you have to bring up the SPA?
What, like the modern SPA?
No, like the classic, like heyday, early 20th century SPA.
Oh, I mean, that would be a good way to do this.
Talk about them. What do you mean there?
SPA.
That's the Socialist Party of America, which is like, oh God, I brought up now Eugene Debs. Eugene Debs ran for president in the United States, and I'm not like super familiar with their politics, but
it was all over the place.
Yeah, you had something called sewer socialism, where it was kind of like racist and workerist, but they were all about building like new sewer lines and public work projects and stuff like that. But you also had better aspects of it.
You also had communists in there. I mean, like
Yeah.
And Debs was pretty communisty himself. I mean, he had arguments with some of the things that Lenin did, like executing the Tsar's family. He didn't think it was necessary and wrote a letter about it. But in general, he's pretty supportive of the Bolsheviks from like 1917 to 1921.
But I think the point in bringing. Oh, sorry.
No, but the SPA was hyper coalitionist. That was the issue. Like it took everybody in until the CP USA broke it up.
Right.
But it still exists in some way because it is actually the root guru, to use Buddhist terms, of both the SPUSA and the DSA. Like they both actually claim the mantle to be the successor of the SPA.
Right. I was gonna say also with the reason to bring up the SPA at all, though, is not as like an example of like a center tendency, but more of like an example of like what winning candidates as a workers' party would mean in the United States. And I think that was, for all their flaws, that was like their biggest impact, was that they actually could win seats, and it like made socialism seem plausible, you know?
Yeah.
But the modern SPA is a fucking joke, and is it's to the right of the DSA now, from what I've seen. It's pretty gross.
But not to the right of the Communist Party USA,
which is also absolutely disgusting.
Well, yeah, let's maybe move on.
Yeah, there's no need to get into that much more. But
okay. Hey, no, I'm not supposed to be cursing. I decided I'm not going to curse. It's very hard. No sex. Let's keep going. Or sex. Yeah.
Wait,
Tom, you're a little choppy, babe.
I think he's saying no more joy of sex.
Oh yes, yeah. No more sect Olympics.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Let's
it's fine. It's impossible not to. Just an amusing story. I did a degree in mathematics, and there was a book that I found in the library called "The Joy of Sets." I thought that was quite a good one.
Oh my god.
Oh Lord.
Not like I'm.
Oh man, nerd communism. All right.
Yeah. Full pun communism.
Let's keep going.
Sophie, you want to read this one?
Okay.
Sure.
Yes.
The core of the political strategy of the center tendency was to build up the workers' organized movement, and especially the workers' political party as its central institution. In their view, as the organized movement of the working class grew stronger, so would the self-confidence of the class and its ability to take political decisions and oppose them on the bourgeoisie and the state, both in the struggle for reforms and in mass strike waves or revolutionary crisis. A powerful mass party of the working class, which had at its core aims the perspective of the working class taking power, overcoming the regime of private property, would be the essential instrument of the working class asserting an alternative form of authority.
Yeah.
It's what I like about this idea about the party. If we think, I know that we are, commies or Marxists or socialists, whatever we want to call ourselves. But the idea that, sorry, Derick, I'm just going to mute you. There's a bit of background noise. I think it's when you hit your keyboard or something. But the idea, like if you look at a capitalist system and you look at how businesses are organized, businesses have their board of directors, have a managerial system going through for controlling that. But the business doesn't have a direct line to tell Parliament and the country what to do. But they do have mechanisms whereby their opinions do get reflected into the party that controls, say, the state. And what we should be thinking as leftists is that we should have left organizations that have specific purposes. Now, I'm not saying we should mirror whatever, bourgeois or capitalist society has, but that we should be thinking about the design of our separate institutions with respect to purpose and how they can interact and interlock. And I think the idea brings that forward.
You're breaking up again, Tom.
Ah, for fuck's sake! I was such good stuff. Okay, let me boot my route. You guys have a
Sure. Okay. So what I like here is especially this like long last sentence, both in the struggle for reforms and in mass strike waves or revolutionary crises. A powerful mass party would, you know, still be like super important for actually making the bridge to communism.
Right.
So like it's not that maybe what we could say is that like even for the chosen tactics of the left and the right, the import of a mass party is obvious.
What it made me think of too is this kind of, and I don't know if we've ever explicitly talked about this on this series, but like the confusion around the term social democracy, right? Like, you know, the meme of social democracy killed Rosa Luxemburg, right? But the truth of the matter is that Rosa was a social democrat.
Right.
But what social democracy meant back then is different than what we mean now. It's like revisionism, right? Like,
yeah.
Originally a social democratic party was just the party of the working class, the proletarian party, which advanced the class interests of the proletariat in parliament, which is basically exactly what Tom was talking about. And I think before we can have a revolution, having a voice and having somebody advocate for the working class in is important, because they have they have so much power and so much influence, and we're not to expect like huge concessions at all, really, but like there is an advocate for us, and then there's also that confidence in that we can govern. The working class can govern. We don't have to rely on the bourgeoisie to keep order in this society.
Also, it gives a place for actual working class interests to be more purely manifested, as opposed to like in our current coalitionary world where we have to pick between one faction of bourgeois reactionaryism and another faction of bourgeois sort of kind of quasi progressivism, kind of sort of not really. And like the fact that the working class doesn't vote in the United States like makes perfect sense when you think about it that way.
Absolutely.
They're all, I mean, and like this is not to say that all the working class in America is Marx woke. A lot of them are paranoid conspiracy theorists, but there's a reason why they don't vote. Like, and actually, it's probably the same reason why a lot of them turn to paranoid conspiracy theories. There's no outlet for their interests. They have tangential outlets for their interests, but those are constantly shifting. So
they're shifting and they're being fed from reactionary sources. Yeah. Kind of a funny little story, and then we can move on. Before I was, when I was a little edgy anarchist, I had a friend who was talking about Kautsky, and there was like some graph that had like, I don't know, like a big circle in the middle and then a circle around that. And I was like, oh, they were talking about social democracy. It was like, oh, social democracy, dumb. We should put that book on and use it for target practice because it looked like a target. So,
wow.
Yeah, I've come a long way, I suppose.
There is a quip in Marx and Engels' writings where is it Marx or maybe Engels that objects to the term social democracy because, well, of course it is scientifically incorrect because once we overcome democracy, and that they vastly prefer the term communist. But I think ultimately Marxism is inherently socially democratic in a specific sense,
right?
That McNair is laying out.
Lexi, do you want to take this next paragraph?
Absolutely. And this ties very much into what you were saying, Sophie. It is important to be clear that the movement that the center tendency sought to build was not the gutted form of the modern social democracy / laborism, which is dependent on the support of the state and the capitalist media for its mass character. The idea was of a party which stood explicitly for the power of the working class and socialism. It was one which was built up on the basis of its own resources, its own organization with local and national press, as well as its own welfare and educational institutions. This is what made social democracy in the Marxist vein different than like the, you know, right socialist, you know, Lassallean strategy, perhaps. And I don't know, like that we discussed last week, where you want the state to get involved and provide all this stuff. What Marx and Engels are advocating is an alternate power base to the market and to the state.
Well, and this leads to kind of like a strategy question for me, because like reading critiques of the Gotha program, you know, and Marx insisting that the Lassallean program was incorrect because it relied too much on the state. I'm trying to like import that into like a modern context, and maybe a particularly modern US context. And like, I have a hard time thinking that it's a good idea for a socialist party to want to gut welfare programs. Because that just kicks out any kind of you know, feet, or pulls a rug out from under, you know, proletarians. But so I guess like the way I think about how that could apply in a modern context is, in a modern context that's so reliant on government influence in the market, is that we agitate by saying, hey, like these welfare programs aren't enough. And so maybe we try to supplement that through like mutual aid institutions in a party, or I don't know. I'm just kind of spitballing here, but
yeah.
Well,
Yeah,
I think like in the modern case, in most of the modern democracies like Europe or Britain, there is no like alternative to the left, to the right socialist alternative. So,
right.
You know, it doesn't exist yet. So it's hard to map onto today's world.
There is a weird legacy of this sort of thinking with regards to the nonprofit sector, because of all of the awful bureaucratic tendencies that you ended up getting in the trade union movement when abstracted from workers' interests, like even more so. Like there is that third term in sort of political and economic life, the state, you know, private capitalist interests, and then this other thing that's supposed to represent interests beyond profit. So it's supposed to represent social interests. And so this becomes much more clear when in a place like, I don't know, the Bay Area in California, where this is a significant amount of the economic activity or even political activities through this supposedly non-state, non-profit actor.
Right, but the non-profit actors are still dependent on the bourgeois. I mean, that's ultimately
right.
I mean, to be fair, you know, the ultra-left critique of unionism is that too, that it's still ultimately dependent on the bourgeois, and in some real sense, without these other social elements, they're right. To speak to this a little bit, Marx explicitly says we shouldn't like oppose welfare reforms done by the state. When he critiques Lassalle, he's critiquing that as the program to get us out of capitalism. But we know from his argument with the French Marxists, who basically were arguing, you know, that we should seize the state, then try all these reforms, knowing that these reforms won't work, so that it'll radicalize the proletariat and they'll revolt. Marx says no. So,
okay.
That's a trot. I mean, I'm not gonna lie. I've heard many Trotskyists actually make that argument for their transitional program.
Right.
So it's in which even I think even Trotsky would be horrified by, but that's the point. There is reforms. So if you think about it this way, you push for reform so you have the social space to create the social institutions that then could actually usurp the function of those state reforms. So by having the space of like, and the extra capital from, say, something like a medical, you know, like socialized medicine, you could use that capital to reinvest into mutual aid groups, which could then usurp the function of socialized medicine. This is a much longer strategy than I think most Marxists realize.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Thanks for clarifying that. Because I was like, how do I don't know, apply that? It seems kind of dated, but that makes a lot more sense.
Well, if you think about it, like this is in a period where the state wasn't doing a lot of these things already.
Right, and that's what I was kind of thinking was like it was outdated in that like we have a huge welfare even after the neoliberal turn, like the government is very involved in the economy now, and you can't really undo that when without disastrous consequences. But the way Derick explained it kind of fixes that, I suppose.
Yeah, and I guess over the course of Marx and Engels' lives, there was more of the development of the kind of Bismarck welfare state, the kind of explicitly like conservative development of state aid and that sort of thing, and more of the like to a certain degree, like a conservative view on trade unionism and how it could be integrated into the nation. Anyway, we can move on.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting you talk about like charities being the system, but if you go, my missus works for a charity, will remain nameless, but if you work in a charity, you'd be surprised by how many right-wing people work in the charity sector. I would think it's probably 50-50. I think it splits like society. It doesn't split along like whether you're left or right too much. Maybe dependent on the charity, but like the majority of people that are well, I wouldn't know if I would say the majority, but I would say a large portion of the people who do serious charity work in these organizations are those that have the time. There's the people who have inherited a house, or people that have, a very rich partner, etc., that actually end up running organizations in charities when they're on the voluntary basis.
Not unlike the type of people who tend to be big in leftist political life.
Right.
Absolutely. People have got the time to read all this goddamn stuff and post and get daddy to set up a publishing house for them. Okay, let's move on to this. The self-emancipation of the majority. Okay, I'll read this. Let me see. Lexi, you did the last one. I'll read this one. The second central feature of the strategic understandings of the center tendency was that the socialist revolution is necessarily the act of the majority. This is fairly elementary and fundamental Marxism. It formed the basis of Marx and Engels' opposition to various forms of socialist putschism and support for enlightened despots. The object of the socialist revolution is precisely the self-emancipation of the working class majority, and through this, the emancipation of all human beings without distinction of sex or race. The idea that this can be accomplished through the action of an enlightened minority is a self-contradiction. I think that's pretty hard-hitting.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to throw. I mean, maybe it's a vulgarized or Stalinized form of it, but it still seems to kind of throw, capital M, capital L, Marxism, Leninism under the bus as not being, a Marxist concept.
Well, not only capital M, capital L, Marxism, Leninism, but Lenin's conception of a party as vanguard. Even to an extent, like you could say that about Kautsky, but Kautsky at least wanted a mass party, and perhaps the organized people within that, like their representatives, maybe there's a real claim to being a mass vanguard in this self-emancipatory way. I mean, you start to stretch it at that point, but I think it's not as clearly broken off as it is once you get to Lenin.
Yeah, because you can make an argument that the vanguard is at least represented as a form of like a Republican,
right,
democratic Republican kind of institution, which as you said is still a little bit of a stretch, but I don't know.
Yeah, and this ultimately is the. I love how elegant this is. That self-emancipation of the majority is the plank from which to criticize the right and the left, more or less.
Well, and it solves the kind of identity debates that he was talking about, like the earlier chapters too, because as a trans woman,
Oh yes,
I think class is still the central, contradiction or problem in society, and I think the reason why class is, and it's not easily available, but I honestly think that like there's a class basis for why trans people get fucked over. And I think what happens when you abandon class in favor of identity struggles is that you lose that emancipatory element. You're too busy cooperating with the bourgeoisie of your identity movement to have any kind of self-emancipation. Like I do think that the proletarian class is the universal class that can represent all of our interests, because most of us belong to that, including especially trans people.
Yeah, the most insidious forms of that stuff take a necessarily anti-universalist approach, because we are, a minority. Therefore, any kind of majoritarianism in general is necessarily going to harm us. And it's a bit of a tragic framework, because without some form of majoritarianism for the proletariat, most trans women won't be free. They'll be like 10, or proportionately speaking, there'll be some, but most of them won't be. Most of us will not be. And you could say the same for women. You could especially say this for people of color.
Yeah.
And I think it becomes more pronounced when dealing with race and nation, whereas with gender, half the bourgeoisie are women.
Right. Well, I mean, and even more insidious than that is like people who claim to be Marxists,
right?
Who want to like throw out this kind of universal like self-emancipation, and that is the most insidious form of revisionism from where I stand, because they want to claim to represent my interests, and I don't know, they can go off on that forever, I suppose.
No, but it's worth noting, because it's a fundamental difference between an emancipatory democratic politics and a sort of like minoritarian politics of representation or revenge.
Yeah, I mean, and those people often are also very critical of like Leninism and vanguardism in that same way, but yet they replicate that through their identity struggle.
Can I just say that I'm very into revenge?
Yeah,
I think it should be one of our central political tenets.
I mean, I some of my favorite music when I'm feeling sassy and salty is angry punk music, where I just envision myself slitting some man's throat.
That's my girl.
But I can't relate to that. I don't know, revenge. I don't know about that.
Well, I will say that I'm of two minds about revenge. You can't really like go without it, but when it takes hold, it encourages a lot of reactionary tendencies, not the most universalist communist stuff. But who doesn't want to take revenge for the plight of the dead generations? You know? Like,
well, and one last thing too, to kind of talk about like identity movements. It's I think McNair is also acutely aware of this coming out of the gay liberation movement, but like you could really see this with like that movement, the gay movement, and how they got so absorbed in the identity aspect of it and dropped any kind of socialist content it may have had, that now you have cops in Pride, right? And we were talking about this a couple of days ago, and that's a whole nother ball of wax as well, but that really illustrates what happens when you drop any kind of like proletarian like majoritarian like element, universal element from struggle, is that you get just class collaboration, but also it leaves behind the most vulnerable people. And I think with trans struggles specifically, what we're going to see is that white petite bourgeois trans people are going to end up fine and well, relatively well represented, and black and brown trans women are going to still get murdered at like incredibly high rates, you know?
Yeah, and also just proletarian trans women in general be subject to all the same abuses while,
Right.
you know, well-off trans women are living in the future.
Right.
Okay, can we keep going?
Yes.
Indeed.
Lexi, why don't you take this next paragraph?
Rocket. I fucking love this. The center tendency drew two conclusions from this understanding, against the left and against the right. The first was rejection of the mass strike strategy. On this issue, the center presented the anarcho-syndicalists and the left with a version of Morton's fork. The first limb of the fork was that a true general strike would depend on the Workers' Party having majority support if it was to win. But if the Workers' Party already had majority support, what was the need for a general strike? The Workers' Party would start with its electoral majority as a mandate for socialism rather than with the strike. It was for this reason that the center in Auguste Babel's resolution at the 1905 SPD Congress was able to demand the use of the mass strike weapon in defense of or in the struggle for universal suffrage. Okay,
so they're making the point here is like, what's the point in having this like fetishization of the strike as the way, you know, we should be going for our majority first and using it like our mandate as our political mandate to try first, and the strike should be like a secondary kind of an idea. Do you want to go for the second? Sorry, go on.
Well, let's comment on this. You want to go? Sophie?
Yeah, I have a question actually. So like when it says when he's talking about an electoral majority as a mandate, does that mean that he's arguing that like if you have a socialist party that has a majority in parliament or in Congress, that it should just enact its minimum program from within the bourgeois government? What is he trying to say there? Because that seems to be counter to what he usually argues for.
Well, that's very perceptive, and he's laying out the strategy in the broadest terms of the center. So he's laying out a strategy that technically describes something that he would want, but also is vague enough to describe the historic center with all of its flaws and mistakes.
So is that idea of an electoral majority as a mandate for socialism part of the center tendency's flaws and mistakes, or is it, does he really think that you can, if you have a majority in parliament, for example, you can just enact your minimum program and just have a dictatorship of the proletariat right then and there?
He ultimately thinks that you need a continental majority to do that. And I would imagine that he thinks of the continental majority in terms of, yes, majorities within like most of the national parliaments, but not taking power in one country before that, which is, you know, that's not something I see argued very often, because there are strategic reasons that would seem untenable.
Right.
But it does seem to follow from the sort of cumulative record of everything that you don't take power as a socialist government in one country.
But then at least my next question, even with that conception of, okay, like say like the majority of the European countries have, you know, a workers' party is in power. I'm assuming you still need to smash the bourgeois state machinery. Like, but that doesn't seem to follow from this. You see what I'm saying?
I do see what you're saying. It's the question of what does it mean to implement the minimum program?
Right.
And for McNair, implementing the minimum program would dismantle the bourgeois state, and in terms of its armed wing, at the very least, if nothing else.
Okay, so why don't we describe what this minimum program is? Because a lot of people have no idea what it is.
Sure.
So the minimum program is a set of reforms that have evolved over time, that are seen as the necessary preconditions to start developing towards socialism. Some of them are kind of immediate political issues. Some of them are like complete rewrites of the structure of legislation, the structure of legislative bodies, the abolition of large parts of the executive branch. Like, you know, when people read a minimum program, which they often are kind of shocked at how reformist some of the things are, and then how incredibly radical other of the things are.
Right.
Lexi and I like literally tried to go through, I don't know, a history of like maybe we read
Oh my
like
God.
40 different minimum programs, but ranging from historical parties to sex licks to
Yeah.
and then like 10 transitional programs. And it was a mess, but I learned a ton from doing it. And the thing is, the critique of the minimum program by the Trotskyist was that you never get beyond the minimum program. As soon as you start getting its most basic reforms, you start having to get into a defensive posture. So that's something to keep in mind. But that's the idea. And if you did implement certain elements of the minimum program, such as the restructure of the entire legislation, usually it bars upper houses, it limits executives, it like abolishes appointed generalships. You know, like if you do that, you really have smashed a lot of the bourgeois state apparatus.
Yeah.
But I guess my response, I'm just inherently skeptical. Maybe I'm a closet, leftist or whatever, but I'm just inherently skeptical of being able to do that through a simple electoral majority. You know what I mean? Like that doesn't seem tenable. I think what might be tenable is that you do have revolutions, like say, like I don't know, like Great Britain and Spain, like has a revolution, and then it kind of starts spreading to other countries, and then the few remaining countries that don't have that revolution, since they already have socialists in a majority in parliament, they're just like, well, like we're going to become part of this international thing now, so fuck off bourgeoisie. I think that is reasonable, but I think without any I have a hard, and I guess he's obviously a revolutionary, so like
he thinks this will lead to a civil war. I mean, we're going to be honest. The crypto thing in this is like, once you start to do this, the reactionary factors will start acting extra governmentally, and you will have a civil war. The thing is, you want to be in the position of already having authority and at least social authority when it's declared, not in the position of looking like you're a punchist. That's the difference.
Right.
Okay. Yeah.
And so like I guess the challenge would be from like the Rosa Luxemburg school of like autonomy and mass strikeism that I think is in the way that you were saying, Derick, along the lines of defending democracy from the bourgeoisie in a civil war. That would be where the true like autonomous self-emancipation of the proletariat is coming from. Whereas, like, because I do agree, kind of resonating with Grant's kind of anti-politics comments on McNair, that there's a tendency to substitute these political acts for the acts of the class, and that not that I'm opposed to some kind of Republican expression of the interests of the class, and not that
Grant would be either, actually.
Yeah, and ultimately I do think structurally speaking, those are primary. Those are the things that really alter the social order forever. But it does seem that those actions of the class are not as dispensable as McNair sometimes sounds like they are, because in agreeing with Kautsky, like, and
well, the other elephant in the room is this has never actually happened.
Yeah.
One thing to say is like that in reality, if you think about, let's say, like Austria all of a sudden now had a radical left party, very, very unlikely they would exist in Europe, say. We're talking specifically about the developed world. Most of this is about the developed world. So we're talking about like a capitalist country sitting in Europe. Can it get like a radical communist party existing on its own? Like this book is written about, like, because internationalism is also at the center of its strategy, it should be like that across like a vast swathe of a developed continent. There would be this, there would be lots of different parliaments would be getting close to this position. So you're not taking it on your own. Usually it would, if you had a big one get to the, like say if you had a Germany or a France get to the position where they're able to get 60% of the vote, and they went in to do this, that the enthusiasm of the left of it doing that would probably lead to similar stuff happening all over the place, whether officially through the parliament or not. Just like, the Tunisian revolution sparked a wave of revolutions in other countries that had similar types of political structures, that it would light a fire. And I think that, we kind of have to think about it, systemically in that order. Does that sound reasonable?
Yeah, that really answers my questions and my concerns. I guess also the kind of way, like, if you have several countries or like maybe like a large section of the United States well, no, okay, let me think of a better example. Let's say you have like a socialist parties trying to enact a minimum program, and that triggers a civil war in Europe, right? It's and like the U.S. isn't quite there. The extra electoral kind of strategy at that point would be to like organize strikes in solidarity with the countries in revolution and try to like put on pressure on our own governments. If we can't do it electorally and politically, we do it socially at that point. Even if we don't initially have a revolution immediately in the United States, we take a stand with the countries that are in revolution.
Okay. Lexi, do you want to go with the second limb?
Yeah, let's make it happen. The second limb of the fork was that the strategy of the working class coming to power through a strike wave presupposed that the Workers' Party had not won a majority. In these circumstances, for the Workers' Party to reach for power would be a matter of conning the working class into taking power. However formally majoritarian the party might be, the act of turning a strike wave into a struggle for power would inevitably be the act of an enlightened minority steering the benighted masses. That's a hot take, Mac. It's a hot take.
Well, that's a critique of Rosa Luxemburg right there.
Indeed.
The German Revolution failed. Why did it fail? They were 5% of the population. Next,
like, yeah,
it's obvious. It's just goddamn obvious.
Like there are some elements of Luxemburg's critique of social democracy and like Leninist like partyism that I find very like not attractive and persuasive. But this point is difficult to argue against, really.
Yeah, I agree. I like Luxemburg a lot, but this isn't this particular point I don't agree with her. I think she fills in the gaps for other parts of Kautskyism and in particular Leninism that are kind of lacking.
Yeah.
But
yeah,
we
can talk about the dangers of some of this later, because I know I'm really sanguine and trying to give it its best face forward. I do parts of this I agree with, but there's a lingering suspicion that there's a conflation of political class with sociological class in a way that makes some of this suspect, and we'll come back to that later. Let's move on.
What do you mean, Derick? Don't just drop a bomb like that. Explain yourself.
Well,
I'm comfortable, Derick is uncomfortable.
It's something I've thought about a lot, because I'm not sure how I think about it. Mass organization of the workers here. McNair seems to say that it's self-emancipation, but he takes that emancipation as largely led by the institutions and the organizations the proletariat creates. But whether or not those things stay proletarian is not really, like, once they're organized, is not really ever dealt with. And I actually think that is a big blind spot. It doesn't undo his argument, but it's something you have to think about in implementation. And when we talk about this later, because the elephant in the room for me is nobody's ever done this, including McNair. Like,
I mean, including McNair. I mean, including all the people that there are like statues and portraits of that we've read multiple books by. I mean, like all of our, like, I don't know, like at the height of the workers' movement, at the height of workers' power, this stuff didn't happen, and
Well, what I think is like telling though is that this stuff didn't happen, but neither did like the official story of the Bolshevik Party. That didn't really happen either. You know what I mean? And I think to me that's where Luxemburg kind of fills in some gaps and like looking at the need for both like a institutionalized, vanguard, but a vanguard in the sense of like the most advanced elements of the working class and its relationship to the spontaneity of the working class. Like that's kind of where the whole idea of base building falls apart, as we've talked about before. You can't force the working class to do this sort of shit. Otherwise you do end up looking like, this kind of like, enlightened minorities steering the stupid masses. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, a better take on that is that for us leftoids who are, thinking too much about this shit, we build these institutions, but we can't force the spontaneity, which is kind of the kernel of truth with the anti-politics as well. They go a little bit too far or get too wizard language about it, but
I like the term that's sometimes thrown around, political creationism, for like ultra voluntaristic base building.
Right.
Like,
yeah. I mean, there's also I'm gonna ask you guys a question, my peeps, and you tell me. So far, what's the difference between this and the Maoist mass line?
Explain the Maoist mass line to me.
Yes, you get everybody involved. You have the institutions of revolution listen to those people, and then you have those institutions help them organize and deliver what the masses want.
Sorry,
go ahead, Tom.
Sophie.
Oh, okay. Well, I guess the first thing that comes to mind, I guess, is like, was that really what happened?
But that is their justification. That is not what happened. But that is like,
that's.
But if you're arguing with a Maoist, particularly the ones that are not hopped up on Z and Ding crack these days, they will tell you, that's why it didn't work. It's because we didn't do what we said we were going to do, which is the actual mass line. But, they tried that and, it worked well. And I don't know, they'll say it worked well in Cambodia, or maybe they'll say it worked well in Cambodia the first and second time. Like they get really cagey on what they think counts and doesn't count. It worked well when we went out into the, Latin American jungles and just randomly killed peasants. I don't know.
I think there's a better way of looking at this. Like, let's say a more defensible form would be something like the Black Panthers,
right?
Where they're influenced by a mass line strategy, was just really trying to figure out what the self-perceived interests of Black people were, politically speaking.
Yeah, and of the proletariat as a whole. I mean, they had these internal debates about reaching beyond the Black community too. And those debates were heated. Whenever we talk about the Black Panthers, we talk about them as if they were a coherent thing. But you should the Hampton versus Stokely Carmichael versus what's his face, who ended up a conservative anyway, the leader of the BLA.
Right.
Cleaver. Those guys denounce each other viciously internally.
No, for sure. But I think
look. The idea here is obvious. We don't have to look to how Maoists didn't actually do what they said they were going to do.
If anything I've learned from studying sociology is the obvious is usually wrong.
Well, okay. Let me use another word then. Loads of different political parties of all different stripes, they say they're going to act this way and they act a different way. And what we're saying here is that the party would have to, whatever this structure, we're going to call it a party, would have to be fundamentally democratic to its core, and not just
but what does that mean?
Vanguard or whatever.
Well,
you can design parties to be structurally democratic. But obviously look at the Bolsheviks and how they operated. It was a vanguard.
Right.
And Mao's party, do you think that it was really super democratic?
No.
Well, no.
And
some people think Mao's
depends on what you're talking about, but in general, no. I mean, like,
yeah, exactly. So there's an obvious smell test on these things, and if you don't have the right fucking design of a party, you're going to end up precisely in the wrong place by the end of it.
Here's
one thing I would say, like, about one thing just before, because I forget my point as well, is like that one thing I say as well is like, how come no one's ever tried it? Blah 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 blah. We've had essentially one, maybe two cycles in history of proletarian revolutions. We had, maybe you could say, like, there was it the 1870s and then the 1920s ones. Yeah. That's what we've had in Europe. We've had two cycles, right? Neither of them have done it really well in the two cycles.
There's an attempted wave.
You might actually say actually that the Paris Commune actually did do it, but they got defeated. But the other waves, they didn't do it. And what we're saying is, like, if we think about history in the long haul, there might be 10 waves before the proletarians actually kind of go, Jesus, all these things we've done are stupid. And they get it right once. They only have to get it right once. Like the capitalist class, the capitalist class only had to get it right once to defeat feudalism. And they, the right strategy.
No, I actually don't agree with that either. It took a lot
because they fell
in one revolution. Yeah, they fell over the course of 300 goddamn years. Like,
yes, but Derick, they got it wrong initially. This is what I'm trying to say. They got it wrong, and it took quite a number of them to get it right. And once they got it right, they got it right. And it should be that's what we should expect. And when we're trying to compare like stuff like Mao or the Bolsheviks or Cuba, or who take your pick about why they don't work, none of them have kind of followed this kind of core line in reality.
I want to circle back and kind of address Derick's original point of like, how is this different than mass line? And I think like my answer, honestly, is that if we're talking about like a mass line, Panthers aren't perfect. We shouldn't fetishize them, yada, yada. But like, if we're talking about a mass line in the Black Panther Party, to me, that's the best version of it, honestly. And if that is a litmus test, then really we shouldn't be that different from that, on it, in my opinion. Like,
Lexi knows what I'm getting at.
I don't know.
You guys don't seem to. Lexi knows what I'm getting at here.
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately it comes down to what do we mean by democracy, and that's something that it's a question that the book asks without answering, but it asks it very forcefully. Like, what is this party democracy we speak of? What is this magic mechanism for transforming proletarian social interests into institutional design that doesn't accidentally make a new class?
Yeah. So how do you not create like a new political class, kind of like similar to some arguments about the USSR or a bureaucratic class?
Yeah. Class, caste, whatever you want to call it.
Right.
Same damn problem.
Right. Well, I mean, I think McNair is struggling with it, but this is like, my point about Maoist isn't that I really care. I don't think there's a good prior model either, nor do I think the revolution is doomed. What I really want people to ask themselves, we say democratic, we throw it around as if we have any idea what it actually means. And maybe we do, but I've never seen a party, even when people sincerely believed it, actually have a functional setup internal democracy. And I've read a shit ton of party constitutions and stuff now to try to figure this out. It was McNair who inspired me to look at this. And when I actually looked at even the constitution of the party McNair is in, I was left kind of cold. Like, in some ways, bourgeois democracy has actually been more functional and more democratic, even though it's not, than what we've ever been able to do.
But look, Derick, where do parties like the CPGB come out of? Where do all these little left sects come out of? Whether they're anarchists or not, they're like, a lot of time are these people who want to be in charge of that group. And that's the fundamental problem with most of the designs, whether it's actual like the legal writing of the design or the intrinsic social operation of the party, is that they are vehicles for my ego over your ego, and Like the only like when a party will come along and will actually not do that, it'll probably be a party it'll need the social base to make a party like that grow, but
I don't think that party here's what interests me and worries me. If we think about this, do we think that a workers' party, even if it self-conceived itself as a workers' party, in this environment now, if it started to emerge, would it understand itself to have began as socialist? And I don't know that I think it would have. There's too much baggage there. And that's that's something I think a lot about. I think maybe we could do this. I think maybe we could even, but like I remember there was this weird, kind of Nazbolish, not really. I shouldn't throw that word's been overused lately. Tendency, in 2016, to see banning workerism as an attempt at a rightist form of this. But a lot of people well, there's some kind of workers' party. I don't think it's going to look like. I have a hard time imagining, as much as I love AOC or whatever, that a workers' party in the United States is going to look like the DSA, because the DSA's demographic is around Greenpoint, the Bay, Portland, and around people who are highly college educated. And no one has ever shown me a stat to disagree with that. So what do you do with that?
But the thing is, Derick, it's if we come up with a really good party form right now, okay, and we tried it out, it'll probably do nothing.
Yeah.
Right?
Great.
It has to be when the conditions are correct that it will move. But the problem with most parties and how they're structured, and the people who are in power or started to want them to operate, look at any of these little truck groups, any anarchist kind of a thing, look at any kind of bourgeois parties type of one, they may get control. They may actually win a socialist or communist revolution. And what's the likelihood of what will happen? It'll fall back just like the revolutions that were won in the 20th century. Because unless that party is able to act not like one of these lines for a central committee, they will fall apart and they will lose. Eventually, it's just an inevitability. They will lose their motor power or whatever.
Well, I think, and I think the first part of what you said is really kind of the only way I can think of to address that is that it doesn't mean we just sit around our ass and wait for the magic of worker spontaneity to come into effect. But what it does mean is that all we can do now is leftoids sitting around a microphone and a book is try to organize some kind of institution that when the next spontaneous thing happens, it won't just fizzle out or be co-opted, right? And I think as far as the question of democracy is concerned, is that it'll never be perfect, but I think the best that we can hope for is put in kind of checks and balances, but not with other institutions, but with the workers themselves. Make everybody make it easy to recall people in positions of power, and that might lead to other problems potentially. But there's no. I guess generally my point is that there's no easy answer for this. That's the bitch of it. You know what I mean?
But you look at, say, people who have actually thought about this, say, the guys who did Paricon, participatory economics, right? They actually sat down and they thought, actually, we need to actually sit down. The problem is we don't have these exact designs correct. And they put a lot of effort into designing their system, right? And maybe that system, or maybe it's a bad one. But what's happened to that system designed 30, 40 years ago? It's sat in a few books. I think there's a couple of little publishers that work with them, because that's just the reality. Whether it would be good or whether it would be bad, the state of the economy or the state of the working class at the moment, that it just won't take it. Okay. Now, maybe those forms or similar forms or good forms will be used at a point in the future. all we can hope to do, I don't even think we can hope to like try and even set up organizations that will even do anything with say the same institutional form. I think that's even, yeah, honestly, I think that's like probably like, what's the point? I think what we can, the best we can do is to actually get people talking and thinking about these ideas. You know, like people, when the DSA falls apart, or when Bernie falls apart, yeah, or when Corbyn falls apart, all these smug people,
or for God forbid any of them actually win.
Oh no!
But
That's what Tom said.
That's what I mean. They'll fall apart. Yeah.
Right.
So,
yeah.
So when that happens, like Syriza and like all these things, when it happens, all these people, like I saw some interview. Who was the interview with? It was some guy who's involved anyway with Novara Media and that thing connected to Corbyn and like
Aaron Bastani.
Yeah, it's not him. It's another guy. I can't remember. He was interviewed on the Dead Pundit Society.
The Tisky Sour guy? Am I thinking of the right guy?
No, not him. No, another guy. He was
I don't
on.
listen to either of those podcasts, so I don't know.
I used to be a Novara diehard back when it was 2 people. Now that
it was and also when it was like autonomous, somehow ended up as Social Democrats. But anyway.
Anyway.
Yeah, exactly. They're totally gone. You know, and yeah, I've got personal. I could tell you stuff, but I've indirect links to it. But when that stuff falls apart, there was one guy. He was on like the Dead Pundit Society, and he was like slagging off like these Marxists, you know, and they're talking about the fallen rate of profit. God knows if he's listening to my podcast. It's the worst podcast of all time. It's all I've talked about for about 5 years. But he was like slagging it off and go, "We're in the real world. We're trying to get stuff done." When that shit falls apart, what are people going to pick? Yeah, what we want to be doing is, you know, getting this strategy stuff right. And, you know, it'll only be true failure of the current mode. And our ideas are not the current ones. This current cycle of history, they're going to fall on their ass. Yeah. And then it's going to come back. And in 10 or 15 years, they'll go, fucking hell, Varn was right, or Lexi was right. Sophie, they had a fucking, they know what was going on. Why didn't we, you know, and it's not
people
to say that,
hollow blogs.
Yeah,
people doing hollow blogs about our discussions as if we're talking about books from the 1920s. Yes.
Cool. There'll be holograms of us. We'll have somehow mapped our voice into holograms. I'll be karate chopping Derick, telling him to shut up. And I'll be talking over Sophie. It'll be brilliant. It'll be great.
Yeah, podcasters log start date. Yeah.
Well,
but like, it's not the only thing about being right either. It's just about like, it's about trying to analyze it. You know what I mean? It's not about like, oh, you were wrong. Who gives a fuck? Yeah, I've been wrong with most stuff in my life. But it's about trying to understand the thing and get at least getting it out there, because it's not in. It's, you know, is this book? Is these arguments? Are people really talk about this in the left? Really, like the people, you know, the vast majority of people on the left, the people who think, oh, I like Corbyn, or Aaron Bastani, he's good. He did a sassy video about Venezuela. You know, they don't know this shit.
I mean, Tom, even the people who have read this book don't really talk about it.
No,
like really.
This is the thing. We have watched something emerge from this book that supposedly take this book and Hal Draper, who also McNair likes, as major inspirations, and it do all the things the book warns against. So like, that's just fresh in my mind right now. And that's the American example, which is, you know, its own kind of special microcosm, and it's super micro. Let's not get that wrong. But also when the CBGB actually tried to do left unity efforts to try to start some of this, oh my God, did it go badly? So
yeah, I have a metaphor for us. I have a fucking metaphor for us. Okay, this book is being implemented like a fad diet. Okay, the people who are who are people who are always doing different diets and going, oh, maybe this diet is good. Yeah, oh yeah, I lost 3 pounds in this diet, and then they put the weight fucking back on the next day. Why is it?
This is the keto.
They're not interested in it at all. They don't apply it. It's a fad. and that's all that this
so
is.
It's a keto, and like next week we'll be back on all carbs all the time, and it's
this is the diet for today.
That's not wrong.
Oh Lord, it's too right.
That's depressing because you're right, because the people that I've talked to about this have gone through many other phases since I've known them.
Well, it also explains why in America the Marxist Center has like weird anti-revisionist and also weird ultra cults. You know what I mean? like it's just something to do for them. I guess I'm not quite as cynical as Tom is as far as like organizing. I don't think it's 100% pointless, but I do think like focusing locally and just like getting people who are interested in this stuff and trying to like have these discussions primarily and being a part of your community secondarily, I think is kind of the key. And maybe that's just my old anarchist habits dying hard, I guess. But
I don't know. I'm old. So,
I'm very cynical. I'm not very cynical. I don't mean it in a real but I you guys try a red party. I don't know anything about how it's set up. I hardly know about it. But like it could.
Tom, you're chopping up.
You're breaking up. Yeah.
You guys.
Your router might need to be reset.
Yeah, you got to restart your router. All right.
So let's actually we'll let Tom come back and continue his rant that now I'm disturbed by.
We've kind of worked our way, to the argument against the right. Who wants to read that?
The argument against the right was also an argument against minority action, but minority action of a different kind. The right argued that a workers' party, while still a minority, should be willing to enter a coalition in government with the middle class parties in order to win reforms. The center argued against this policy. The center argued this policy was illusory, but primarily because the interests of the middle class and those of the proletariat were opposed. Behind this argument was the one made by Marx in 1850, that it would be a disaster for the Workers' Party to come to power on the backs and support of petty proprietors, since the Workers' Party would then be forced to represent the interests of an alien class.
Oof.
Ooh.
Yeah. 1850, people. Yeah.
Ooh, that burns. I mean, like, look, I know that trots throw around petite bourgeois as an ideological formation like way, way too much. Right. Like, to everyone and their mom, like, and anyone who looks at them funny is petite bourgeois. But like, there's a truth to that, particularly in the relationship to the Democrats. And honestly, in the relationship to Democrats, it's not even petty proprietors; it's just outright proprietors.
Right.
Like, I almost would have a sympathy for like a petite bourgeois class in America, but there isn't. I mean, they don't have a representative either.
Right. And the long-term kind of Marxist read of that kind of middle class is that they can't form a stable political coalition. They can only buddy up with the big bourgeoisie or the proletariat, ultimately.
Right. And Marx said that if like when Marx talks about this in the Communist Manifesto, he talks about the petty bourgeois has an incentive to proletarianize. But you wouldn't come to power on a coalition of them. You would come to power and then invite them in because it would be in their interest, usually. But I mean, honestly, in reality, their interests would probably split. But depending on where you are in the hierarchy of petty proprietors, you might be all over the place. And then, to be honest with you, there's all these labor aristocratic, and I don't mean this in the way that Maoists do. I mean people it's hard to scab on. Labor aristocratic factions in the United States, that their interests are, and they dominate the left. And look, I'm a member of that class. I'm a teacher. You can't scab on me. So like, I'm not gonna say I'm not a worker, but I'm not like, there's a world of difference between me and a McDonald's worker.
Right.
Yeah.
Derick,
me and a
can you hear me?
factory worker. Yeah, gotcha. And you're clear now. You can continue your rant.
Yay!
What could do is I could pick a scab and then throw it at you.
Oh my god!
Oh, Jesus.
A friend
He
of
really
mine.
is back with me.
A friend of mine is a very, very funny guy, but we were out drinking and we were like, he telling us how he had, he opened his wallet to get his bank card and I noticed he had something weird in his wallet. I said, what's that? And he said, oh, that's a scab. And I was like, what? He goes,
What?
oh, I picked a scab today. It was a really big one. It was really good. So I kept it. And I was like, what are you talking about? And we were sitting there, we were trying to chat up these, and we were like, I was like, to embarrass him, I said, hey, Derick, why don't you, his name was Derick. I said, hey, Derick, why don't you show them, why don't you show the girls what's in your wallet? And he was like, oh yeah, look at this. I got this big thing. Oh my God. One of the funniest things I've ever seen in my life. Oh my God. For that.
So he had a literal scab.
He had a
literal. So what you're saying is that the dude had a literal scab in his wallet, but I bet you he didn't have a union card.
Funny.
Oh well,
he's a listener to this show actually, so he's a lefty.
Shout out.
I hope the scab didn't help him win any chicks.
It sure as hell didn't. The look of like sheer terror in their eyes. Oh man, it was very, very funny.
Right.
As the appropriate proletarian response should be. All right.
Indeed. Fucking scabs.
Nobody likes scabs. All right, let's go on. All right.
Let's read this
quote. Who said this quote? Let me go look it up.
I think it's Marx.
Yeah.
It's Marx, isn't it?
It's Marx. I think it's the quoted quote. Let me double check.
Contextually, that would make sense.
Number 16. It's the same as 16, which is.
So I'll read it out. Well, I'll read it out while we're looking it up.
It's his collective work.
Okay.
It's either Marx Engels' collective work, so it doesn't say which it is.
So this is likely from his speech to. Is this on the first? Is this the first Congress? Or is this like a Congress of the First International? I don't remember exactly the time frame here. There's a famous speech on the permanent revolution, essentially, in 1850, that a lot of this strategic stuff is derived from. And it's the major sort of like post-manifesto, early Marx political work, I guess you could say. So I'm guessing that's where it's from. I'm going to read it out. We are devoted to a party which, most fortunately for it, cannot yet come to power. If the proletariat were to come to power, the measures it would introduce would be petty bourgeois and not directly proletarian. Our party can come to power only when the conditions allow it to put its own view into practice. Louis Blanc, the French socialist who participated in a Republican coalition government in 1848, is the best instance of what happens when you come to power prematurely. I mean, now we have some more live examples or something. Not live. Now we have some better examples. Do I have to draw that out anymore?
No, I think that's really good.
That one.
I think that's just a great quote. It says what it says in the tin, doesn't it? Let's go for this next one. I don't think there's too much to that. We're kind of covered a lot of these things in previous chapters but let's have a read of this. This is Engels wrote to Turati in 1894. At a common victory, we might perhaps be offered some seats in the new government, but always in a minority. Here lies the greatest danger. After the February Revolution in 1848, the French socialistic Democrats were incautious enough to accept such positions. As a minority in the government, they involuntarily bore the responsibility for all the infamy, treachery which the majority, composed of pure Republicans, committed against the working class, while at the same time their participation in the government completely paralyzed the revolutionary action of the working class they were supposed to represent. You know, there's been a long troll that you had like one of the party that was like the dominant party, and they needed somebody for a coalition time, and every time the coalition, what kind of corruption happened, it wouldn't really affect a major party because everybody kind of knew they were corrupt, but the small party would get slammed, and sometimes they would lose all their seats after it. It happened again and again and again. And what did these parties always do when they got a chance to go into coalition? They always went into coalition, you know, and it's so stupid. You know, from a revolutionary communist point of view, the same thing would happen.
But yeah, like the most live example I can think of was the liberal Democrats that bore a lot of the punishment for the ridiculousness of the conservatives in the United Kingdom.
And the Greens in Mexico bear a lot of the corruption markers of the PRI for the same reason, because they're always in coalition with the PRI. So yeah, that happens over and over and over and over and over and over again. I mean, you know, and I think the Greens maybe, I mean, yeah, the Lib Dems are the ones that Americans might know, but the Greens in Mexico might be easier to understand because they're actually closer to a socialist party.
Like in Ireland, you had the Democratic left, you've had the Labour Party, you had the Greens, you had Democrats, you've had you've had literally most of those parties have ended up being absolutely smashed to pieces by it. You know, the Lib Dems in England, you know, it's so obvious. Right, well, we move on to patience. We're not going to get all this chapter done tonight. We're an hour and 3/4 on, and we've only done about 3 and 4 pages. So who wants to take this patience one? Sophie, do you want to read this bit?
Yeah, sure. The center strategic line was, then, a strategy of patience as opposed to the two forms of impatience, those of the right's coalition policy and the left's mass strike strategy. The strategy of patience had its grounds in the belief that the inner logic of capital would inevitably tend, in the first place, to increase the relative number and hence strength of the proletariat as a class. That, in the second, to increase social inequality and class antagonism. Kautsky makes the argument most clearly in the Social Revolution. In this situation, the Workers' Party / movement could expect to build up its forces over the... Scroll down, please. Over the long term to a point at which it would eventually be able to take power with majority support.
Okay. So
you know, patience.
Patience.
Yeah, I don't have it. My initial thought when it comes to that is that there is this inherent tension between our current situation with ecological crises and the strategic importance of patience. Like, I do think that like patience is incredibly important as a socialist strategy, but we can only be so patient, and then that leads to some potential pitfalls where the center will either fall into a left or a right strategy due to that pressure. And my hunch is that it'll fall into a right strategy. I don't know. What do y'all think about that?
Hello.
Oh, can you all hear me?
Sorry. Yeah, I could hear you, but I was just at the chat for a second, so I missed it. Can you just repeat the last what your point was there for a second?
Yeah. So there's a tension between a strategy of patience and ecological crisis, right? Like it kind of feels like there's a ticking time bomb in the environment, and so that creates this problem to where like how long do we be patient, and then if because of that pressure, will the center strategy kind of capitulate to the right or to the left? And I think it'll most likely capitulate to the right. Is that a good thing? Is that necessary? What do y'all think? Is that a bad thing?
To respond to that directly would be, for me, like, essentially what this needs to be at base is a rejection of the kind of panicked short-term instrumental reason that you always seem to get in politics, no matter if there is, global warming or nuclear war or the imminent revolution around the corner. There's always another reason to be panicked and obsessed with short-term outcomes. And I think the ultimate thing to say to that environmentalist impulse is that that's part of what got us here, is the refusal to not do this and to continue to panic in this very short-term way has actually collaborated with capitalism to destroy the environment. It hasn't actually gotten us out. Okay. And the fact that we only have 15, 20 years left doesn't mean that that doesn't mean that we capitulate to 2-year electoral cycles as our exclusive horizons.
Okay, I agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, it's interesting when I read this patient strategy stuff, when I think about the policy of Irish Republicans in Northern Ireland, the Sinn Féin. I don't know if people know too much about them, but they've had incredible patience with their strategy since the mid-70s in their political strategy of having doing an electoral strategy alongside their their armed struggle, and then also with the Good Friday Agreement going towards essentially a demographic strategy. And they've also never they had a strategy also of never representing, never sitting in Parliament in Westminster, never taking an oath to the Queen, and never participating in politics of the UK. And it seems like sometimes it kind of goes against them short term, but politically it's worked incredibly well for them. And I'm always been amazed by and how well they stick to their line. It really shows that you need to utilize patience. They use it in such a way that they went from having no seats in government, or say of their in Northern Ireland, to having been the biggest party in Northern Ireland. That takes well, maybe joint biggest, but you got to think 40, 50, 60 years, and that's just the reality of politics, the reality of humans and how they change their minds, and how young people come up and how they live in a different milieu. And I just think that as commies or whatever, it's just an obvious truth of political strategy.
Agreed. Yeah, thanks for addressing these ideas.
Yeah, with the addendum, of course, that there are good reasons to think that our a window for opportunity for fixing a big thing is more urgent than normal, even though there's always a reason to be kind of I don't know, kind of hyper militant or whatever. That the environment does pose a significant challenge for kind of keeping those short-termist tendencies at bay. The Green New Deal, for instance, is very attractive to people all across Marxism that are just starved for answers for what to do about, the apocalypse, quote. And yeah, this is something that it's going to take some really difficult, nuanced patience to deal with, for the reasons that I guess are drawn out in the next paragraph.
Okay. Let me do this one because my voice.
Let's get Derick.
So nice.
All right, I'm here. We're at the strategic line, right? The strategic line.
Here, Derick, what about your, like, do you read that fast to your kids when you're trying to teach them? Do they have any fucking idea what's going on in your classroom?
I don't ever teach seniors, so I don't read to them very often. The strategic line can be summed up as follows. Until we have won a majority, identifiable by our votes in the election results, the Workers' Party will remain in opposition and not in government. While in opposition, we will, of course, make every effort to win partial gains through strikes, single-issue campaigns, etc., including partial agreements and with other parties, not amounting to governmental coalitions and not involving workers' parties expressing confidence in these parties. As a side note, this is pretty much the United Front strategy that Trotsky has used in the 30s, right? Or pretty close to it.
Right.
You don't enter formal coalitions with bourgeois parties, even though you will strategically support them on single issue campaigns. You never say you have confidence in the party, only the issue. And that's opposed to the Popular Front strategy. What is interesting to me is a lot of people seem to devolve McNair back into a Popular Frontist on the lines here.
It's kind of amazing to think that Bhaskar Sankara popularized this book among the American left. Like,
yeah, oh my God, yeah. I mean, the guy who literally thinks we need
Jacobin
he thinks the Popular Front is good. Just time the Social Democrats just need to be in charge, as opposed to the Stalinists. Right. I mean, like, woo, yeah.
Right,
Some people are either bad readers or really acting in bad faith.
Yeah.
Both.
Or there's something about the strategy presented here that seems untenable or unrealistic to people that are trying to apply it to our world. And I think there's a problem here, but it's sort of the problem that Marx was always trying to address, of the two dominant tendencies and the excluded middle of those dominant tendencies.
Very much so. Let's have a go at this in the next paragraph. When we have a majority, we'll form a government and implement the whole minimum program. If necessary, the possession of a majority will give us legitimacy to coerce the capitalist or pro-capitalist and petty bourgeoisie minority. Implementing the whole minimum program will prevent the state in the future serving as an instrument of the capitalist class and allow the class struggle to progress on terrain more favorable to the working class. So one thing we didn't really mention when we're discussing the minimum program is one about how you would disband and totally radically change the nature of the army. So the army would be based on local units, and the people would have their own weapons, and it's not like some crazy top-down structure whereby, you know, the righteous can get control of it and just mill everybody.
Right.
Yeah. And so, yeah, I'm basically reading this as kind of like elaborating on our early discussion on like electoralism and the minimum program. And to be more clear or precise about what he's meaning, to me, it seems like he's saying that in a parliament, if you have enough of a majority where you can form a government without a coalition with any bourgeois or petite bourgeois party, you do that, and then you form, then you enact your whole minimum program. Am I reading that correctly or elaborating that correctly?
Yeah, and then again, this is stated in a general way so that it can apply to the historic Kautskian Center and to the refined version that McNair will posit later.
Okay.
Okay, I think this is kind of an interesting kind of a bit he puts here, where he's going to talk about how in the, you know, the most organized, or the most developed Western countries, whereby there's a proportional increase in the professional managerial part of the workforce. An increasing proportion of the total population of imperialist countries become wholly or partly dependent on the spoils of empire. The version of the strategy of patience adopted by the SPD leadership depends on Workers' Party actually achieving an electoral majority. but the economic and social effects of imperialism in the imperialist countries mean that this is unlikely in any single imperialist country outside of conditions of acute political crisis. What does he mean by that, Derick? Like, why does he think, you know, in one country, an imperialist country, they can't do it?
I think he is kind of crypto buying into this, like I don't know. There are moments where I am always sure the effects of imperialism imperial culture means that it's unlikely any single imperialist country and outside of the coalition.
Can I say what I don't think? What I don't think he's
Go ahead, yeah, because I think this is because I don't think he's signing off on it either, but
well, because he explicitly, at least to take him at his word and to try to read him consistently, like he consistently says otherwise to the idea that the workers that benefit the most from, you know, the exploitation or capitalism or imperialism will necessarily be more reactionary or more conservative. He explicitly argues against that as against the third worldist variant or Maoist variant of labor aristocracy theory, where all the proles in the first world are actually somehow, you know, they're exploiters because of this value distributionist thing.
Right, that somehow that the state has made. I mean, it is literally a conspiracy theory where the state classes have made some kind of arrangement with the business class to buy off.
Well, there's that, but even if you frame it in a structuralist way, it capitulates the extractive idea of exploitation and who is an exploiter into something that really coincides with and dovetails with a sort of neoclassical distributionalist look at exploitation. And it's simply about, if you end up receiving more than, you know, the standard wage, it makes you an exploiter, even if you're not the extractor. And that's like a dangerous road. And that's, I think Anwar Shaikh in his big old book on capitalism does a good job of saying that this kind of move in the analysis of imperialism really does sacrifice important aspects of the heart of Marxist economics and capitulates them to bourgeois economics. And that's not to say that these value transfers between the first and third world or what have you are not important. But
I've met third worldist parties who actually reject the labor theory of value so that they can maintain some of that stuff. Yeah. But to get back on this, so why still can't it be that an imperialist country do this on its own? Well, because there is the theory that was often held by the Second International itself that it actually had to happen in the imperialist centers first.
Well, the imperialist centers, you know what I mean? Like, we're dealing with a single country here.
He is saying a single imperialist country. So he's like saying the case that if England...
Like it won't happen in the United States or England, yeah.
Well, like the United States is a bit different, I think, because it's so far to get to militarily and it's got a load of nukes, you know, but say back in the day, if it happened in like France on its own, that, you know, the Germans would come in and kick the crap and so would the British and the Spanish. I think that's his general point. It has to happen in all of these at the same time.
Yeah, they would be out necessarily.
It doesn't have to actually happen in all of them at the same time, but it has to be such an amount of socialists in the other countries that it can't happen. Or it will affect it. They would be wary of it. If France went socialist commie in the morning and Germany wanted to invade, but they had like 40% of their workforce were also commies, they would find it very difficult to actually do that. It would probably lead to a revolution at home. You know what I mean?
Right.
So I think that's kind of what he's getting to.
Yeah, that's what I was hoping he was getting to. I mean, it makes sense too if you think about the bourgeois revolutions actually kind of had to work that way. Like you had to break up these imperial, and by imperial here I mean literally like old school empires with emperors. Like you had to break up the imperial blocks and then you couldn't do it all at once. I mean, you couldn't do it only in one country. It had to spread elsewhere. If you try to do it only in one country, like England, you had the Great Restoration. Like that's the bourgeois example of the same problem. So that makes sense because I actually know, just also from reading like McNair's articles on the Weekly Worker, that he's not like, he'd never be a third worldist, but he's not even one of those people who had a lot of stock in the developing world leading the way for the imperial world either. He didn't see a whole lot of hope in that either. So he must mean that it just has to happen in a bunch of countries at once.
Yeah, or close to, or be so strong in other countries as to completely stop an invasion.
Right.
You know, I just think this idea of like the managerial classes being in the hock with the capitalist class, I think it's kind of overstated, because like if you think about the managerial class, did they make way more money than the petty bourgeois?
Depends on the specific type of petty bourgeois. Right. I mean, petty bourgeois income ranges in the United States, like from barely above poverty line to probably $400,000 a year. So I would also say the managerials also range from barely above poverty. Well, not barely above poverty, but like $30,000 a year, all the way up to $40,000 a year, probably.
You know what I mean? So like this idea that all the managerial class are in love with capitalism, I think I just don't buy it. I think it's the same idea that Marx or Engels said, that, you know, you can get a portion of the petty bourgeois onto the radical side, you know, and I do think that the same with the managerial. Look, I was part of the managerial class. I fucking hate it. I knew loads of managers who are working in there. They hate all that crap.
Actually, some of the most radical people I know are like former bankers. So.
Yeah. And, you know, as well, the people who are managers, they like get to a certain stage, you know, they know what it takes to go up and above and higher, or how they have to do to get there. And they might hate themselves for doing it, or they might never be able to get higher because they wouldn't do the crap. You know what I mean? So I don't think it's that important a tendency. I just thought I'd say that. Right. Look, with 2 hours going, we're not going to start a whole big section now and go on to.
We're about halfway through.
So we've got like halfway through the chapter. This is like maybe the most important chapter if we think about it, because it's the one that's going to it's going to explain to us, you know, what it is we're kind of thinking we should be in favor of. So it's not a bad thing to break this one into two. You know, it's a lot more important this than, you know, whether, you know, what we should do in time of war, I think, but, you know, like the next chapter. Right. So which is probably, you know, much longer than this chapter. But what do people think then? Is there anything, what we've covered today, is there anything sticking out before we sign off?
Kind of tangentially related, like, to our conversations about enacting a minimum program and breaking up you know, the military. One thing that puzzles me is, like, if we're breaking up the military as like a way of smashing the bourgeois state machinery, what does it mean for, like, I don't know, like a navy, you know what I mean? Or like, because like, or just like these branches of the military that are I don't know, like very specialized and might be necessary to defend ourselves from you know, Germany invading France, or etc. Like all these examples we've been talking about. Like, that's one thing I've never quite been able to figure out. You know what I mean? Because like, how can you can replace, like, you know, in the army in the traditional sense of, like, you know, grunts with, like, you know, a people's militia. Great. You can't really replace a navy with a people's navy. You know what I mean? Like, what, does everybody get a boat? You know, I'm being kind of silly, but
yeah, that's a broader question of Democratic Republican institutional forums that, yeah, I mean, if you talk to liberals about these sorts of things, the complexity of the modern world just creates the conditions that make specialists and professionals necessary. Mm-hmm. And it is hard to see sometimes when that wouldn't be the case in these bigger questions. And that's really the whole nature of the problem that we're chewing on. How would you have something as, big and legitimate and internationally significant that would still have this character?
Right.
Like you could imagine that, say, when it comes to like Navy, let's say the British Navy has got like, I don't know, 50 boats or whatever, like that, you could decide to distribute them geographically and let each city or zone where they reside have control over each one. I think there are schemes for how you could do it. What do you do with a nuclear bomb silo? You know what I mean? Like, let's say they're all in, like, goddamn, they're probably in New Mexico, are they? Arizona, or Utah. They're probably all off there. Those.
I'm not at
dead
liberty
zone
to talk
states.
about that.
Those desert,
You can
dumps,
buy. You
know what I
can
mean?
actually buy the lot. Seriously, the government sells them now, and you can convert them into mansions.
That's true.
I've heard that,
Wow.
but what do you do with the nukes? What do you do with the nukes?
They're not there anymore. I don't know where they're at. Actually, a lot of them are in what's that? Mountain?
Submarines.
Well, yeah,
A lot
but
of them
there's
in
also
submarines as well.
there's also the mountain. There's a mountain where we literally dispose of them. It's in Arizona, I think.
Huh.
Oh, I didn't know that. Well, actually, no, I did know that because there's like uranium burying and uranium mines in the Navajo reservation, which is long.
Not sketch at all. Anyway.
Yeah, that's fine.
That's why that mountain's green.
Yeah. Well, what's really the bitch of it all too is like, if last time I was on the res, like the mines actually closed down and the economy stopped, and so it was a damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of situation. But anyway, kind of to circle back on the Navy, like kind of example that Tom was giving, I think rather than letting like a city, I do think you need some kind of specialism. Sorry, not sorry. Like rather than letting a city determine what to do with a boat referendum, like you think the city should elect an officer to handle it.
Well, whatever the mechanism, we're never going to do all the
exactly, something democratic.
But the general idea is that you break up this idea of the armed forces as a coup machine. That's the general gist, to destroy the coup machine.
Yeah, I actually do kind of think you could. You can't have a people's navy, but you can have a people's admiral. I mean, like,
that's a good point.
I mean, like, although this kind of stuff is where I started flirting with Bordigism and organic centralism, and just like we'll just figure out who's the most competent and put them in charge. And then I was like, oh yeah, that's really authoritarian.
And that's also how you get coups.
Yeah, that's the kind of hand waving that McNair is like, no. Let's really look at that, and not that he's doing all of the fucking democratic theory that one would have to read to take these questions seriously. But God, is he ever setting up this question in particular to get us re-engaged with the idea of democratic institutional norms?
I have actually, this book inspired me to start reading, and I'm actually serious about that. When you guys told me to read this book a couple years ago, I started reading on the history of democracies, like overall, to really get a better grasp of what it really means. Because I don't think most people have even republicanism. I mean, like, we're not even good at that. So, like,
no, we're not.
And I don't even want to talk about. I'm one of the few people. Like, a lot of American left liberals love parliamentarism, and I'm like, oh God, that's the worst. But sorry, Britain. But
well, it sounds so nice compared to our like pseudo monarchy, or federalism.
Yeah. Well, it does.
But still, it's bullshit.
I read a 1988 book about how democratic the U.S. isn't. That was pretty enlightening, but it did get into but parliaments aren't as democratic either, and then federal parliaments are actually like probably the worst formation of ours. Because federal parliaments, he goes into like, I forget the author. It's how the book is literally, it's how democratic is the U.S. Constitution ?
Yeah, I guess that becomes especially important when we realize that we can't take executive power except under like the circumstances that the center kind of delineates.
Which means, yeah,
right, like having a separate legislature from an executive is actually kind of nice.
But it also means that almost all voting leftist strategy in the United States is exactly backwards.
Right. Yes.
Yeah, there are. One thing I didn't say earlier when we were talking about the minimum program and electoralism is that I am 100% convinced that will never work in the United States. Like, I don't think you can't really, because what that would require is that we would have to amend the Constitution out of existence.
Yeah, I brought this up when we were writing our own minimum program in the Red Party. Actually, is like, you can't do this without us already having militarily taken over the country, because we can't. We it's not just amending the Constitution. I mean, like, you'd have to amend the Constitution and not be the Constitution anymore, or we'd have to have a coup and have a constitutional convention. In which case, why are we bothering being democratic about this again? Like,
well, next week
it's a way to measure. It's a way. I think the real point is it's the way by which you can measure your strength and say and have societal respect for your strength.
Yeah.
You know,
even if there was a military like victory that would be necessary, we would still have to have democratic norms to have a majority support.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think the other thing as well is you could probably just have some when you won your election. Could you not say we're having a convention, you know, a constitutional convention? And the fact that you do that would probably start the war.
Well, yeah. And next week, when we get to talk about the state and the theory of the state that Marx and Engels are working with, and their idea of what, you know, bourgeois government is versus what McNair ends up thinking bourgeois government is, we will get into the issue of the Constitution and constitutional loyalty.
Right.
Okay.
That's a pretty good place to leave it off, huh?
Yeah. Very good. Let's have a quick look into the chat and see who's been in there. It's so long today. I don't know if I can possibly go through it all. We've had Oswald Spengler. We've had Dave Solentuna, Erica Wheeler, Jara Handala. We've also had Oman Damp. Who else have we had? We've had Jake P. A lot of stuff going on in here. We've had Constantine as well. Who was after last
Noki Blood, Red Renegade 29.
Nice.
It's 29.
Paul Hansel giving out about my revenge. I am a revengist. That's my key political.
But I said you weren't a Maoist.
A Maoist. Well.
I don't trust people who have a strong one to punish, but I also don't trust people who don't value revenge.
That's true. Yeah.
There's a
redneck Nestor. I'm about it.
Whoa.
The revenge dialectic. McNoki blood. What does that mean? McNoki blood. Okay, I think that's everybody.
Benjamin Hanshaw.
Oh, Hanshaw's in there. A regular.
Yeah. Robert Dahl is the author of the book I think you're talking about.
Dr. Forbin. Dr. Forbin as well. Let's not forget Dr. Forbin. Okay, everybody. Well, thanks very much for coming on, and we'll bring this discussion offline. Can we have a group goodbye? It's so much fun.
Goodbye.
Goodbye. Thanks for watching.
Red salute.